600 CE, the Arabian Peninsula. To understand the birth of Islam, one must first understand the world that preceded it. This was not a void, but a complex, fractured, and deeply traditional landscape. To the historians of the era, this period is known as the *Jahiliyyah*, the age of ignorance. But ignorance in this context does not imply a lack of intellect or culture. Rather, it refers to a spiritual state, a period before the light of divine revelation had reached the hearts of the people. The geography of Arabia dictated the rhythm of life. It was a land of harsh extremes, dominated by vast, unforgiving deserts and jagged mountain ranges. In this environment, survival was not a matter of individual strength, but of collective loyalty. The fundamental unit of society was not the nation-state or the individual, but the tribe. The tribal landscape was governed by a strict code of honor known as *Muruwa*. This unwritten law emphasized bravery in battle, hospitality to strangers, and most importantly, blood vengeance. If a member of one tribe was killed, the entire tribe was obligated to seek retribution, often leading to blood feuds that could rage for generations, devastating entire lineages over a single perceived slight. This cycle of violence created a society that was perpetually on the brink of tribal warfare, where stability was a fragile illusion. Socially, the peninsula was a patchwork of lifestyles. In the deep desert, the Bedouin nomads lived a life of constant movement, following seasonal grazing lands with their herds. Their culture was oral, preserved through epic poetry and genealogies that were recited with immense pride. In contrast, the settled populations lived in oasis towns and trading hubs like Mecca and Yathrib. These urban centers were the arteries of the peninsula, connecting the spice routes of the East with the markets of the Mediterranean and the Byzantine Empire. Mecca, in particular, occupied a unique position. It was more than just a commercial crossroads. It was a sacred sanctuary. The Kaaba, a cube-shaped structure at the heart of the city, served as a central shrine for a pantheon of polytheistic deities. Hundreds of idols resided within and around its walls, representing various tribes and their specific gods. Pilgrimage seasons brought diverse groups together, facilitating not only trade, but also a complex exchange of ideas and cultural influences. However, this religious plurality sat alongside a growing social tension. The traditional tribal values of sharing and protection were being challenged by the rising wealth of the Meccan merchant elite. As trade flourished, a growing gap emerged between the powerful clans and the marginalized, the orphans, the widows, and the impoverished who had no tribal protection to shield them from the whims of the wealthy. At this moment in history, the Arabian Peninsula was a pressure cooker of spiritual longing and social upheaval. The old ways of blood vengeance and polytheistic ritual were meeting the harsh realities of a changing economic world. The people were caught between the fierce independence of their tribal roots and a desperate, unspoken need for a higher moral order, a unifying force that could transcend bloodlines and bring justice to a fractured land. It was into this volatile, poetic, and turbulent world that the first whispers of a new revelation would soon emerge. 610 CE, the mountains of Mecca. Amidst the social fractures and spiritual unrest of the Arabian Peninsula, there lived a man whose life would fundamentally alter the course of human history. Muhammad ibn Abdullah was not a man of the warring tribes or the decadent merchant elite. He was known as *al-Amin*, the trustworthy. In a society built on shifting allegiances and broken promises, His reputation for integrity was a rare and precious commodity. Yet despite his standing, Mohammed felt a profound sense of restlessness. He looked upon the idols of the Kaaba, the tribal blood feuds, and the widening gap between the rich and the destitute, and he felt a deep, aching dissonance. Seeking solitude from the clamor of Meccan commerce and the spiritual void of his surroundings, Mohammed began to retreat. He would journey to a small, rugged cave nestled high in the Jabal al-Nur, the mountain of light. There, in the silence of the cave of Hira, he would spend days and nights in contemplation, searching for meaning in the vastness of the desert sky and the stillness of the stone. He sought a truth that the poetry of the Bedouins and the rituals of the Meccans could not provide. On a night in the month of Ramadan, the silence of the cave was shattered. The historical accounts describe a moment of overwhelming intensity, a moment that transcended the physical world. According to Islamic tradition, the angel Gabriel appeared to him, not as a gentle messenger but with a commanding, divine presence. The encounter was not a peaceful meditation but a cosmic confrontation. The angel commanded him, "Ikra, read, or recite." Mohammed, trembling and overwhelmed, responded with the words that would define his humanity. Ma ana by kari, I am not a reader. The command was repeated, more forcefully this time, pressing upon him with a weight that felt almost unbearable. It was a moment of profound ontological shock. For a man accustomed to the quietude of the mountains, the sudden intrusion of the divine was terrifying. The revelation was not a whisper. It was a shattering of the veil between the seen and the unseen. Finally, the first verses were imparted, words that would become the foundation of the Quran. Read in the name of your Lord who created man from a clinging substance. As the light of the revelation receded, Mohammed was left alone in the darkness of the cave, his heart racing, his body trembling with a fear that was both physical and spiritual. He was no longer merely a merchant or a seeker. He had been touched by the infinite. He fled the cave, racing down the mountain toward his home, driven by a desperate need for comfort and understanding. When he reached his wife Khadija, he cried out, "Zamiluni, Zamiluni, cover me, wrap me." He was gripped by a terror that he had encountered something beyond human comprehension. It was Khadija who, in her profound wisdom and strength, calmed his spirit. She did not doubt him. Instead, she became the first to believe, providing the psychological and emotional sanctuary he needed to process this monumental transformation. This singular event in a lonely cave was the spark. The silence of the Jahiliyyah had been broken, and the first tremors of a revolution were beginning to ripple through the heart of Arabia. 610 CE, the streets of Mecca. The initial years following the first revelation were characterized by a quiet, almost clandestine spread of the message. This was the era of secret proselytization. Mohammed began to share the message of Tawhid the absolute oneness of God, with those closest to him. The early community, or the Sahaba was small, fragile, and composed largely of the marginalized, the youth, the enslaved, the widowed, and the destitute. They met in the shadows of the city, often in the house of Al-Arqam, forging bonds of faith that were deeper and more resilient than the ancient tribal lineages that had defined Arabian life for centuries. However, a message that challenged the social hierarchy and the economic foundations of a society cannot remain in the shadows forever. As the call to prayer began to echo, not just in private, but in the public consciousness, the ruling elite of the Quraysh tribe took notice. For the merchant princes of Mecca, Islam was not merely a theological challenge. It was an existential threat. The Kaaba, adorned with hundreds of idols, was the beating heart of the Arabian economy. To preach that these gods were powerless was to threaten the pilgrimage industry, and by extension, the wealth and prestige of the powerful clans. What began as mockery and ridicule soon curdled into systematic, brutal persecution. The early Muslims became targets of intense psychological and physical warfare. They were subjected to social boycotts, denied access to resources, and faced public humiliation. The persecution was often most severe for those without tribal protection. We remember the story of Bilal ibn Rabah, an enslaved man who was laid upon the scorching desert sands, a heavy stone placed upon his chest, as he was forced to renounce his faith. Yet amidst the agony his voice rose in a single defiant word, Ahad, Ahad, asterisk, 1, 1. This steadfastness became the hallmark of the Meccan period. It was a time of profound testing, where faith was not a matter of convenience, but a matter of survival. The community saw the rise of martyrs, individuals who chose death over the renunciation of their conviction. This period of suffering served a dual purpose. It purified the resolve of the believers and demonstrated the moral superiority of their cause to those watching from the sidelines. As the pressure intensified, the Prophet Muhammad sought ways to protect his followers. He directed a group of believers to seek refuge in Abyssinia, a Christian kingdom ruled by the Negus, a leader known for his justice. This migration was a pivotal moment, proving that the message of Islam could transcend the borders of Arabia and find sanctuary in the hearts of others. By the early 620s, the atmosphere in Mecca had become untenable. The deaths of Muhammad's protector, Abu Talib, and his beloved wife, Khadijah, left him vulnerable. The year of sorrow had stripped away his earthly shields, leaving the burgeoning community at the mercy of an increasingly hostile Quraysh leadership. The tension had reached a breaking point. The coexistence of the old order and the new faith was no longer possible. The stage was set for a transition that would move Islam from a persecuted minority to a political and social reality. The era of endurance was nearing its end, and the era of the state was about to begin. 622 CE, the outskirts of Mecca. The atmosphere in Mecca had reached a fever pitch of hostility. The Quraysh leaders, sensing that the Prophet's influence was growing despite their efforts to suppress it, moved from persecution to a calculated attempt at assassination. A plot was hatched among the various clans of Mecca to strike Muhammad simultaneously, ensuring that no single tribe could be held responsible for his death. But where the leaders of Mecca saw a target, God saw an opportunity for a transformation that would change the course of human history. In the dead of night, under the shroud of darkness, Muhammad and his closest companion, Abu Bakr, slipped out of the city. They did not head toward the open desert to wander aimlessly. They headed toward Yathrib, an oasis town north of Mecca that was currently fractured by bitter tribal warfare between the Aus and the Khazraj. The journey was one of extreme peril. For days, they moved through the scorching heat of the Hijaz, hiding in the mouth of the cave of Thawr to evade the trackers sent by the Quraysh. It was a moment of profound tension, a moment where the survival of the mission hung by a single, fraying thread. Yet, as the trackers passed by, the silence of the cave became a sanctuary. This was not merely a flight from death. It was a strategic withdrawal, a migration of necessity that would be etched forever into the Islamic calendar. When they finally reached the outskirts of Yathrib, The reception was unlike anything the prophet had experienced in Mecca. The people of the oasis, weary of their own internal blood feuds, saw in Mohammed not just a religious leader but a mediator, a man capable of bringing order to chaos. They embraced him with open arms, and the city was renamed Madinat al-Nabi Medina, the city of the prophet. The Hijra was the catalyst for the most profound shift in the Islamic narrative, the transition from a persecuted religious minority to a self-governing community. This was the birth of the Ummah. In Mecca, the believers were defined by their shared faith in the face of suffering. In Medina, they would be defined by their shared responsibility to one another in the face of governance. To facilitate this, Mohammed drafted the Constitution of Medina, a revolutionary document for its time. It established a confederation of tribes, including the local Jewish communities, granting them religious freedom and legal protection in exchange for mutual defense of the city. For the first time, the bond of faith, the Iman began to supersede the ancient, unbreakable bonds of blood and tribe. The Muhajirun, the migrants from Mecca who had left everything behind, were paired with the Ansar the helpers of Medina, who shared their homes and wealth. This social engineering created a new kind of kinship, one based on shared values and ethical conduct rather than ancestral lineage. The Hijra, therefore, was more than a journey from one geography to another. It was a journey from the private to the public, from the spiritual to the political. The Hijra marked the end of the era of mere endurance and the beginning of the era of the state. The seeds of a civilization had been planted in the soil of Medina, and the world would never be the same. 622 CE, the heart of Medina. The transition from a persecuted community to a sovereign state was not merely a change in location, but a radical reimagining of social order. With the Constitution of Medina as its bedrock, the Prophet Muhammad began the delicate task of weaving together a fractured tapestry of believers, tribes, and local Jewish populations into a single political entity. This was the birth of a new type of society, the Ummah, where justice was not the prerogative of the strong, but a right protected by law. Governance in Medina was characterized by a profound sense of communal responsibility. The Prophet acted as both a spiritual guide and a statesman, mediating disputes that had simmered for generations, and establishing a system of welfare that ensured the poor and the orphaned were not forgotten. However, this new oasis of stability was a direct threat to the status quo in Mecca. The Quraysh, seeing their economic and social influence waning, could not allow this burgeoning state to thrive. The peace of Medina was soon shattered by the reality of existential warfare. The first major test came in 624 CE at the Battle of Badr. It was a clash that seemed, by all conventional logic, to be lopsided. A small, poorly equipped force of Muslims faced a well-armed Meccan caravan and its military escort. Yet the outcome was a stunning upset that sent shockwaves through the Arabian Peninsula. The victory at Badr provided the nascent state with much-needed legitimacy and morale, proving that the Ummah could stand against the traditional powers of the Hijaz. But victory brought further trials. In 625 CE, the Meccans returned with a vengeance, seeking retribution at the Battle of Uhud. The struggle was fierce, and the Muslim forces suffered heavy losses, including the loss of Hamza, the Prophet's uncle. Uhud was a brutal lesson in the perils of internal discipline and the volatility of war. It was a moment of profound grief that tested the very resolve of the believers. They learned that survival required more than just faith. It required strategic cohesion and unwavering patience. The conflict reached a psychological turning point at the Battle of the Trench in 627 CE. As a massive confederacy of Meccan and allied tribes descended upon Medina, the Muslims employed a tactic never before seen in Arabia: the digging of a massive trench around the city's vulnerable flanks. For weeks, the city endured a grueling siege, facing starvation and the constant threat of betrayal from within. But through diplomacy and tactical ingenuity, the siege was broken and the Confederacy retreated. This victory signaled the end of Mecca's ability to launch large-scale invasions, shifting the momentum of the struggle permanently. As the years progressed, the Prophet's diplomacy became as potent as his military strategy. He began to forge alliances with outlying tribes, expanding the sphere of influence of the Medina state through treaties rather than just the sword. He understood that for the **** to endure, it had to be more than a military camp. It had to be a diplomatic powerhouse. By the time the tides of war had fully turned, the stage was set for the inevitable return to the city of origin. The Medina period had accomplished the impossible. It had taken a scattered group of refugees and forged them into a disciplined, governed, and resilient civilization. The battles for survival had not only preserved the faith but had tempered the community, preparing them to step onto the global stage. 628 CE, the outskirts of Mecca. The tension that had simmered for years between Medina and the Quraysh finally reached its breaking point. The Treaty of Hudaybiyah, though initially perceived by some as a diplomatic setback, had provided the Muslims with something more valuable than a battlefield victory. It provided time. It was a period of strategic breathing room that allowed the *** to grow, to consolidate its strength, and to expand its influence through peaceful outreach. But the fragile peace was short-lived. When the Quraysh violated the terms of the treaty by attacking an allied tribe, the Prophet Muhammad realized that the time for negotiation had passed. In 630 CE, a massive force of 10,000 Muslims began their march toward the city that had once expelled them. This was not merely a campaign of conquest. It was a movement of historical inevitability. As the Muslim army approached, the leadership of Mecca realized that resistance was futile. The conquest of Mecca was a moment of profound moral significance. Rather than the bloody retribution one might expect from a returning conqueror, the Prophet entered the city with humility. He issued a general amnesty, declaring to his former persecutors, "Go, for you are free." This act of unprecedented clemency transformed the landscape of Arabia. It was not through the destruction of the Meccan elite, but through their absorption, that the city was brought into the fold of Islam. The Kaaba, which had for centuries been a sanctuary for hundreds of idols, was cleared of its polytheistic statues, restored to its original purpose as the singular house of worship for the one God. In a single stroke, the spiritual and political center of Arabia was reclaimed. The unification of the peninsula followed swiftly. With Mecca secured, the tribal allegiances that had once defined Arabian life began to dissolve, replaced by the shared identity of the ***. Tribes that had once been bitter enemies now found common ground in their faith, creating a unified political front that had never existed in the history of the region. The era of tribal warfare was being replaced by an era of divine law and communal purpose. In 632 CE, the Prophet Muhammad embarked on his final journey, the farewell pilgrimage. Standing atop Mount Arafat before a gathering of over 100,000 believers, he delivered a sermon that would serve as a foundational manifesto for Islamic ethics. He spoke of the equality of all humans, regardless of race or lineage, famously declaring that an Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab, nor a non-Arab has any superiority over an Arab. He emphasized the sanctity of life and property, the rights of women, and the necessity of justice. It was a final, sweeping blueprint for a society built on moral integrity rather than ancestral pride. Shortly after this pilgrimage, the Prophet passed away in Medina, leaving behind a community that was no longer a collection of scattered tribes, but a unified, formidable civilization. The task of the Prophet was complete. He had not only delivered a message but had built a nation. The unification of Arabia was achieved, and as the sun set on the life of the Prophet, a new era was dawning, one that would soon spill out from the sands of the peninsula to reshape the course of human history. 632 CE, the city of Medina. The passing of the Prophet Muhammad had left a void that was both spiritual and political. For the first time, the asterisk Ummah faced a question that would define its future. Who would lead the believers? There was no explicit divine instruction on succession, leaving the community to navigate a moment of profound crisis. In the shade of the Prophet's mosque, the companions gathered, debating the nature of leadership. The decision was not one of monarchy, but of consensus and character. Thus began the era of the Rashidun, the rightly guided caliphs, four leaders who were contemporaries of the Prophet and were seen as the true custodians of his legacy. The first to ascend was Abu Bakr al-Siddiq, the Prophet's closest companion. His reign was defined by an immediate and existential threat: the Ridda Wars. As the Prophet's death sent shockwaves through the peninsula, many tribes viewed their allegiance to Islam as a personal contract with Muhammad that expired with his passing. They drifted away, some refusing to pay zakat, others following self-proclaimed prophets. Abu Bakr's leadership was firm and decisive. He understood that the unity of the asterisk Ummah was inseparable from the unity of the faith. Through a series of grueling campaigns, he consolidated the Arabian Peninsula, ensuring that the nascent Islamic state did not fracture into tribal chaos before it could truly begin. With the peninsula stabilized, the mantle passed to Umar ibn al-Khattab, a man of legendary discipline and administrative genius. If Abu Bakr saved the state, Umar transformed it into an empire. Under his guidance, the borders of Islam expanded with a velocity that stunned the ancient world. The exhausted Sassanid Persian Empire and the fracturing Byzantine Empire could not withstand the momentum of the Muslim armies. Through brilliant military leadership, the Levant, Egypt, and the heart of Persia fell under Islamic rule. Yet, Umar's legacy was not found only in conquest, but in governance. He established the Diwan asterisk, a system for managing state finances, and created a structured judicial system, ensuring that even as the empire grew, the rule of law remained paramount. Then came Uthman ibn Affan, a man of immense wealth and legendary piety. His era was marked by the further expansion of the frontiers, stretching toward North Africa and the Mediterranean. However, his greatest contribution was perhaps the most enduring: the standardization of the Quran. Recognizing the danger of regional variations in the holy text, Uthman oversaw the compilation of a definitive written codex, ensuring that the Word of God would remain uniform from Cordoba to Baghdad. But the era of the Rashidun was also a period of tragic complexity. The third caliph's reign ended in political turmoil, leading to the ascension of Ali ibn Abi Talib, the Prophet's cousin and son-in-law. Ali's caliphate was defined by the fitna the first Islamic civil war. Internal fractures, fueled by grievances over the previous leadership and the quest for justice, tore the community apart. This period of strife was not merely a political struggle. It was the crucible in which the deep theological and political divisions of Islam were forged. By 661 CE, the era of the rightly guided had come to a close. The age of the caliphate had transitioned from the simplicity of Medina to the imperial splendor of a dynasty, leaving behind a world forever changed by the rapid rise of a new civilization. 632 CE, the city of Medina. While the selection of Abu Bakr as the first caliph provided a semblance of continuity, the reality on the ground was one of impending disintegration. The death of the Prophet Muhammad had not merely been a spiritual loss. It had acted as a political earthquake that shattered the fragile bonds holding the Arabian tribes together. For many of these tribes, their loyalty was not to a concept of a trans-tribal state, but to the person of Muhammad himself. With his passing, they believed the covenant was broken. As news of the Prophet's death spread across the desert sands, a wave of secession swept through the peninsula. This was the onset of the the apostasy. It was not a single, unified rebellion but a complex, multi-layered crisis. In some regions, tribes did not abandon the faith of Islam entirely, but they refused to pay the zakat the obligatory alms. To them, the zakat was a tax paid to a leader, and with the leader gone, the obligation had vanished. In other parts of the peninsula, the situation was far more volatile. Charismatic figures emerged from the dunes, claiming divine inspiration of their own. Figures like Musaylima, often called the liar by the Muslims, rose to power in the Yamama region, leading massive tribal confederations that challenged the very foundations of the Medinan state. The advisors of Abu Bakr urged caution. Some argued that the state was too fragile, that the treasury was too low, and that the community should focus on internal stability before engaging in widespread warfare. But Abu Bakr recognized a fundamental truth. To allow the secession of the tribes was to allow the death of the Ummah. If the political unity of Arabia collapsed, the religious message of Islam would be swallowed by the ancient, fractured traditions of tribalism. He famously declared that even if they refused to hand over a single camel that they had once shared with the Prophet, he would fight them. What followed was a series of brutal, decisive military campaigns that would test the resolve of the early Muslim community. Abu Bakr appointed brilliant military commanders, most notably Khalid ibn al-Walid, the sword of Allah, to lead the vanguard. These were not merely battles for territory, they were battles for the soul of a new civilization. From the rugged mountains of Yemen to the fertile plains of Najd, the Muslim armies moved with a ferocity and discipline that the fractured tribal levies could not match. The conflict reached its bloody crescendo at the Battle of Yamama. It was a clash of titans, a struggle where the fate of the nascent Islamic State hung in the balance. The victory of the Muslim forces was hard-won and came at a heavy cost, including the loss of many Hufaz the companions who had memorized the entire Quran. This loss would later become a primary catalyst for the formal compilation of the holy text. By the time the dust settled, the rebellion had been crushed. The Arabian Peninsula was once again unified under a single authority in Medina. The *Rita* Wars had been a trial by fire, a crucible that purged the weaknesses of the early community. Through this struggle, the concept of the *Umma was transformed from a loose collection of believers into a disciplined, centralized political entity. The peninsula was no longer a collection of warring tribes, but a unified springboard, ready to launch the greatest expansion the ancient world had ever witnessed. 633 CE, the borders of the Arabian Peninsula. With the internal rebellion suppressed and the peninsula unified, the newly forged Ummah faced a choice that would alter the course of human history: to remain a localized Arabian power, or to project its strength against the two sleeping giants of the ancient world, the Byzantine and Sasanian empires. The decision was made not merely for conquest, but for survival. The shifting sands of the desert had given way to the geopolitical realities of the Fertile Crescent. As the second caliph, Umar ibn al-Khattab, assumed leadership, the eyes of the Muslim commanders turned toward the Levant, the gateway to the Mediterranean. 634 CE, the Levant. The Byzantine Empire, though exhausted by decades of warfare with Persia, still held the rich, urbanized provinces of Syria and Palestine. The Muslim armies, led by the tactical genius of commanders like Khalid ibn al-Walid and Abu Ubaidah, moved with a speed that caught the Romans off guard. They were not a traditional imperial army, but a highly mobile force of light cavalry and infantry, fueled by a religious fervor that the professional but weary Byzantine legions could not replicate. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Yarmouk. In a clash of epic proportions, the Muslim forces faced the full might of the Byzantine field army. For 6 days, the desert wind carried the cries of thousands. Through superior maneuvering and the exploitation of the terrain, the Rashidun forces broke the Byzantine lines, shattering the Roman grip on the Levant. This victory opened the gates to Damascus, Antioch, and eventually Jerusalem, a city of immense spiritual significance that was surrendered to Caliph Umar in a moment of profound historical weight. But as the Levant fell, a second, even more formidable shadow loomed to the east: the Sasanian Persian Empire. Unlike the Byzantines, who were often seen as foreign occupiers by their local subjects, the Persians were a deeply entrenched, centralized superpower. Yet the Sasanian state was brittle, plagued by internal instability and a succession of short-lived rulers. 636 CE, the plains of Mesopotamia. At the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah, the fate of the East was decided. The Muslim armies faced the legendary war elephants of the Persian Shah. It was a battle of attrition, a chaotic struggle in the mud and dust, but the disciplined resolve of the Muslim ranks eventually overwhelmed the Sasanian heavy cavalry. The collapse of the Persian frontier was rapid. From the Tigris to the Zagros Mountains, the once mighty Sasanian Empire began to unravel, eventually falling entirely to the Rashidun forces, bringing the ancient Persian civilization under the banner of Islam. 640 CE, the Nile Delta. With the Levant and Persia secured, the expansion turned toward the breadbasket of the Mediterranean, Egypt. The Byzantine hold on Egypt was tenuous, as the local Coptic Christian populations often felt marginalized by the religious dictates of Constantinople. When the commander Amr ibn al-As led his forces into the Egyptian peninsula, he found a land ripe for transition. The fall of the fortress of Babylon and the subsequent capture of Alexandria signaled the end of Roman rule in North Africa. By the mid-7th century, the map of the world had been redrawn. In less than 3 decades, a movement that began in the caves of Mecca had dismantled the hegemony of the ancient world's greatest empires. The conquests had established a vast, contiguous territory stretching from the borders of India to the shores of the Atlantic, setting the stage for the rise of a global civilization. 644 CE Medina, the era of the Rashidun, the rightly guided caliphs, was reaching its twilight. For 25 years, the leadership of the Ummah had been anchored in the city of the Prophet, a place of spiritual sanctity and tribal simplicity. But the empire had grown too vast for the desert oasis of Medina to govern. The administrative needs of a transcontinental superpower required more than just religious authority. They required the machinery of a state. As the third caliph, Uthman ibn Affan, navigated the complexities of this expanding realm, the cracks in the foundation began to show. The transition from a community of believers to a sprawling imperial entity brought with it new tensions, tribal rivalries, accusations of nepotism, and the friction between the old Arabian aristocracy and the newly conquered non-Arab Muslims. When Uthman was assassinated in 656 CE, the unity that had defined the early conquests fractured. The period known as the First Fitna, the First Islamic Civil War, tore through the heart of the community, pitting brother against brother and challenging the very definition of leadership. 661 CE Kufa. The dust of civil war began to settle, but the landscape of Islamic power had been irrevocably altered. Following the martyrdom of Ali ibn Abi Talib, the fourth caliph, a new era dawned. Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, the governor of Syria and a master of political maneuvering, emerged as the dominant force. With the establishment of his rule, the center of gravity shifted. The political capital was no longer the sacred, austere streets of Medina. It was the sophisticated, cosmopolitan heart of the Levant, Damascus. This was more than a change of address. It was a fundamental metamorphosis of the caliphate. By moving the seat of power to Damascus, the nascent empire embraced the administrative traditions of the Byzantine world they had just conquered. The Umayyad dynasty transformed the caliphate from a charismatic religious leadership into a centralized, hereditary monarchy. The simplicity of the Medina years gave way to the grandeur of imperial bureaucracy. In Damascus, the Umayyads built palaces, minted standardized coinage, and established a professionalized military and postal system. They were no longer just leaders of an Arabian tribe. They were emperors of a Mediterranean superpower. This shift allowed for a new kind of expansion, one fueled by organized logistics and imperial ambition. From the newly established base in Syria, the Umayyads looked further west, toward the Maghreb and the shores of the Atlantic, and further north, toward the frontiers of Europe. However, this centralization came at a cost. The shift to a Damascus-centric, Arab-dominated empire created deep-seated resentments. The Mawali asterisk, the non-Arab converts to Islam, found themselves treated as second-class citizens, denied the same social and economic privileges as the Arab elite. This simmering discontent, combined with the enduring theological schisms of the Fitna, created a pressure cooker of internal dissent. While the Umayyads achieved unprecedented territorial reach, stretching from the Indus River to the Iberian Peninsula, the foundations of their rule were increasingly contested. The dynasty had successfully transitioned the Ummah from a desert movement to a global empire, but in doing so, they had traded the egalitarian spirit of the early community for the complex, often volatile, realities of imperial rule. The stage was set for a collision between the old ways and the new, a struggle that would eventually lead to the rise of the Abbasids and a new chapter in Islamic history. 711 CE, North Africa. The expansion of the Umayyad Caliphate was no longer merely a series of raids or frontier skirmishes. It had become a relentless westward tide. For decades, the Maghreb, the vast expanse of North Africa stretching from Egypt to the Atlantic, had been a contested frontier. The Berber tribes, fierce and fiercely independent, had resisted the initial waves of Arab incursions. Yet, under the strategic direction of Damascus, the Umayyad military machine had systematically dismantled the remaining Byzantine outposts and brought the Berber kingdoms under the umbrella of the Caliphate. This was not merely a military conquest, but a profound demographic and cultural shift. As Islam moved through the Maghreb, it did not just bring new rulers, it brought a new way of life. The Berbers, once the primary obstacle to westward movement, began to integrate into the Islamic fold. Through a combination of conquest and the allure of a unified social and legal framework, large segments of the North African population embraced the faith. This conversion turned a hostile frontier into a vital springboard for the next great leap in Islamic history. By the early 8th century, the gates to Europe stood ajar. The Visigothic kingdom, once the dominant power in the Iberian Peninsula, was crumbling under the weight of internal dynastic strife and civil unrest. It was into this vacuum that Tariq ibn Ziyad, a Berber commander serving the Umayyad cause, launched his historic crossing. 711 CE, Gibraltar. Legend tells of Tariq ibn Ziyad landing his forces at the base of a massive rock, the Jabal Tariq, from which we derive the name Gibraltar. Behind him lay the Mediterranean. Before him lay the fertile, fractured lands of Hispania. Tariq's army, a diverse force of Arabs and Berbers, moved with a speed and ferocity that caught the Visigothic king, Roderick, completely off guard. At the Battle of Guadalete, the Visigothic military structure collapsed, clearing the path for a rapid Islamic ascent across the peninsula. Within a decade, the Umayyad banners flew from the Pyrenees to the southern coasts of Al-Andalus. This was not just a territorial gain, it was the creation of a new civilization. As the conquest progressed, the Umayyads established a sophisticated administration that blended local Roman Visigothic traditions with the administrative precision of Damascus. Cities like Cordoba, Seville, and Toledo began their transformation from provincial outposts into the intellectual and cultural beacons of the medieval world. The establishment of Al-Andalus created a unique socio-political ecosystem. While the central authority in Damascus maintained a tenuous grip on these distant western provinces, the sheer distance allowed for a distinctive character to emerge, one where the fusion of Arab, Berber, and local Hispano-Roman cultures would eventually give rise to a golden age of its own. Yet, as the empire reached the Atlantic Ocean, its limits were being tested. The sheer scale of the territory, stretching from the borders of India to the shores of Spain, strained the Umayyad logistical and political capacity. The empire was now a mosaic of diverse ethnicities, languages, and traditions, held together by a single faith and a centralized monarchy that was increasingly viewed as distant and exclusionary. The westward expansion had achieved the impossible, mapping the boundaries of a global superpower, but it had also stretched the fabric of the Umayyad state to its absolute breaking point. 661 CE, Medina. While the Umayyad banners were being planted in the far reaches of Hispania and North Africa, a deeper, more ancient wound was festering within the very heart of the Islamic world. To understand the fractures that threatened to tear this sprawling empire apart, we must look back, long before the conquests reached the Atlantic, to the moment the Prophet Muhammad passed away. The death of the Prophet in 632 CE created an immediate and existential crisis. Who would lead the Ummah? There was no clear, divinely ordained successor, and the community found itself divided by a question that would define Islamic history for 14 centuries. One group, which would eventually form the majority, believed that leadership should be determined by consensus and tribal seniority, the Shura asterisk. They supported the election of Abu Bakr, the Prophet's close companion, marking the beginning of what we now know as the Sunni tradition. But another group held a different conviction. They believed that leadership was not a matter of political consensus, but of divine lineage. They argued that the mantle of leadership belonged to the al-Bayt asterisk, the household of the Prophet. For them, Ali ibn Abi Talib, the Prophet's cousin and son-in-law, was the only legitimate successor. This faction, the Shi'atu Ali asterisk, or the partisans of Ali, believed that the spiritual and political authority of Islam must remain within the bloodline of the Prophet. What began as a debate over political succession soon spiraled into a profound theological and emotional schism. The tensions reached a breaking point during the First Fitna, the First Islamic Civil War. The assassination of the third caliph, Uthman, and the subsequent struggle for power between Ali and the Umayyad clan transformed a political disagreement into a blood feud. The tragedy was cemented in 680 CE at the Battle of Karbala. In the scorching deserts of modern-day Iraq, Husayn ibn Ali, the grandson of the Prophet and son of Ali, stood against the massive military might of the Umayyad Caliphate. Husayn's refusal to pledge allegiance to the Umayyad Caliph Yazid was seen by his followers as a stand for justice against tyranny. His martyrdom, and the brutal killing of his small band of followers, became the definitive trauma of the Shia identity. Karbala was no longer just a battlefield. It became a symbol of sacrifice, suffering, and the eternal struggle against oppression. As the Umayyad dynasty consolidated its power in Damascus, moving the capital away from the spiritual center of Medina, the divide became institutionalized. The Umayyads ruled through a centralized, often autocratic imperial model that prioritized the stability of the state and the expansion of its borders. To the growing Shia community, this was an era of usurpation, a period where the rightful spiritual authority of the Prophet's family was being sidelined by worldly political ambition. Thus, as the empire expanded toward the Pyrenees, it was not a monolithic entity. Beneath the surface of the rapid conquests and the glittering cities of Al-Andalus, two distinct currents of thought were flowing. One side looked to the community and the tradition of the companions. The other looked to the sacred lineage of the Prophet. This was the emergence of the Sunni-Shia divide, a fracture that would ensure that while the Islamic world grew in size, it would forever be a house divided. 750 CE Khorasan. For decades, the Umayyad Caliphate had ruled from the marble halls of Damascus, but their foundation was beginning to crumble. To the eyes of many, the Umayyads had transformed from the guardians of faith into a worldly, Arab-centric aristocracy. They had prioritized the dominance of Arab tribes, often treating the non-Arab converts, the Mawali as second-class citizens despite their shared faith. In the eastern provinces, particularly in the rugged lands of Khorasan. A dangerous resentment was brewing. This was a cocktail of grievances: the disenfranchised Persians, the grieving followers of the Prophet's bloodline, and those who saw the Umayyad rule as a departure from the egalitarian principles of early Islam. Out of this discontent emerged a shadow movement, the Abbasids. Claiming descent from Al-Abbas, the uncle of the Prophet, they mobilized a sophisticated propaganda campaign. They did not lead with a specific political platform, but with a powerful, unifying promise. Al-Rida by al-Mahdi *, the chosen one. They whispered of a leader from the Prophet's family who would restore justice and sweep away the corruption of the Umayyads. They were the architects of a revolution that was as much about identity as it was about power. The spark finally caught fire. Led by the brilliant and ruthless Abu Muslim, a general of Persian origin, the Abbasid forces rose in a massive, coordinated insurrection. The revolution was not a mere skirmish. It was a tidal wave. The Umayyad armies, once thought invincible, found themselves overwhelmed by a coalition of the marginalized. The decisive moment came at the Battle of the Zab in 750 CE, where the Umayyad Caliph Marwan II was defeated, signaling the definitive end of the Damascus era. The Umayyads were swept from the throne, with a few survivors fleeing westward to establish a new, separate dynasty in Al-Andalus. But the heart of the empire had been irrevocably seized. With the revolution complete, the center of gravity shifted. The Abbasids did not look to the Mediterranean or the old Arab tribal lands for their new identity. Instead, they looked eastward, toward the ancient, fertile crossroads of Mesopotamia. In 762 CE, the Caliph al-Mansur founded a new capital, Baghdad. This was not just a change of city, it was a change of civilization. Baghdad, known as the City of Peace, was designed as a perfect circle, a cosmic center of the world. By moving the capital to Iraq, the Abbasids effectively bridged the gap between the Arab conquerors and the vast, sophisticated Persian administrative and cultural traditions. The empire was no longer an Arab kingdom ruling over Muslims. It was becoming a cosmopolitan Islamic empire. In Baghdad, the language of administration remained Arabic, but the spirit of the court became Persianate. The era of the warrior-conqueror was giving way to the era of the scholar, the bureaucrat, and the merchant. The wealth of the Silk Road began to flow into the Tigris, fueling a new kind of power, intellectual power. As the dust of the revolution settled, the stage was set for a transformation that would redefine human knowledge. The shift to Baghdad was the signal that the Islamic world was moving out of its era of expansion and into its golden age of synthesis. 800 CE Baghdad. The dust of the Abbasid revolution had long since settled, replaced by the rhythmic scratching of quills and the rustle of parchment. In the heart of this circular metropolis, a new kind of conquest was underway. It was not a conquest of territory, nor of blood, but of ideas. Under the patronage of caliphs like Harun al-Rashid and his son al-Mamun, the Abbasid state began to invest its immense wealth into a project of unprecedented scale, the translation movement. At the center of this intellectual storm stood the Beit al-Hikmah *, or the House of Wisdom. While historians debate its exact physical structure, whether it was a singular grand library or a decentralized network of academies, its purpose was singular and profound. It was a crucible where the wisdom of the ancient world was being gathered, scrutinized, and reborn. For centuries, the great works of Greek philosophy, mathematics, medicine, and astronomy had been the treasures of a fading Mediterranean world. But as the Byzantine Empire's grip on these classical texts loosened, the Abbasids saw an opportunity. They did not see these works as foreign or heretical. Rather, they viewed them as a universal inheritance. To the Abbasid scholar, truth was not the property of any one culture. If Aristotle had unlocked a law of logic, or Ptolemy a secret of the stars, that knowledge belonged to the ****. The scale of this movement was staggering. The House of Wisdom became a magnet for the most brilliant minds in the known world. It was a truly cosmopolitan institution where religion often took a backseat to intellect. Christian, Jewish, and Sabian scholars worked side by side with Muslims, translating the works of Plato, Galen, and Euclid from Greek and Syriac into the soaring, precise language of Arabic. This was not a mere act of copying. It was an act of transformation. The translators were often polymaths themselves, providing extensive commentaries that corrected ancient errors and synthesized new insights. When they translated Galen, they weren't just preserving Greek medicine. They were laying the groundwork for a new, empirical approach to the human body. When they tackled Euclid's geometry, they were providing the tools for the mathematical breakthroughs that would follow. Through this massive linguistic bridge, the House of Wisdom prevented a catastrophic loss of human thought. During the European Middle Ages, much of this classical heritage was largely forgotten in the West. It was the Arabic translations and the sophisticated commentaries added by scholars in Baghdad that kept the light of antiquity burning. By the time the movement reached its zenith, the Islamic world had achieved something remarkable. They had taken the fragmented wisdom of the Greeks, the Persians, and the Indians, and woven them into a single, coherent tapestry of knowledge. The House of Wisdom had turned Baghdad into the intellectual lungs of the world, breathing life into ancient ideas and preparing the soil for the scientific explosions that would soon define the Islamic Golden Age. The empire had moved beyond the sword. It had mastered the pen. 900 CE, Baghdad. If the translation movement provided the raw materials, then the following century saw the construction of a monumental intellectual edifice. The scholars of the Abbasid Caliphate had moved past the stage of preservation. They had entered the era of innovation. No longer content to merely translate the ancients, they began to challenge, refine, and fundamentally expand the boundaries of human understanding. This explosion of intellect manifested most clearly in the language of the universe, mathematics. While the Greeks had mastered geometry, it was the Islamic world that revolutionized algebra. In the bustling markets and quiet libraries of the era, the Persian scholar Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi was performing a feat of mental alchemy. By synthesizing Indian positional notation, the concept of zero, with Greek logic, he authored the Kitab al-Jabr asterisk, from which the very word algebra is derived. Al-Khwarizmi did more than solve equations. He provided a new systematic way of thinking, turning mathematics into a tool for solving real-world problems in inheritance, land surveying, and trade. His name itself would eventually evolve into the term algorithm, the very heartbeat of the digital age we inhabit today. As mathematics provided the framework, medicine became the art of applying reason to the sanctity of life. The Islamic Golden Age saw a radical shift toward empiricism and clinical observation. The world's most influential medical authority, Ibn Sina, known to the West as Avicenna, was at work. His monumental canon of medicine, became the standard medical textbook in both the Islamic world and Europe for over 500 years. Ibn Sina did not just list cures. He categorized diseases, explored the psychological roots of physical ailments, and insisted on the importance of controlled clinical trials. Meanwhile, in the hospitals of Cairo and Baghdad, the concept of the Bimaristan asterisk, the modern hospital, was taking shape. These were not merely places for the dying, but sophisticated centers of healing and teaching, where physicians practiced hygiene, pharmacology, and specialized surgery. Yet the scholar's gaze was not only turned inward toward the human body, but upward toward the heavens. Astronomy became a spiritual and practical necessity. To determine the precise direction of Mecca, the Qibla asterisk, and to calculate the timings of prayer, Islamic astronomers had to master the movements of the celestial spheres with unprecedented accuracy. In observatories from Samarkand to Maragha, scholars refined the Ptolemaic models, correcting ancient errors in planetary motion. They perfected the astrolabe, a sophisticated analog computer that allowed travelers and sailors to navigate by the stars. This was an era of great mathematical precision, where the study of the stars was seen as a way to contemplate the divine order of creation. This was the true legacy of the Golden Age, the realization that faith and reason were not rivals, but partners. The mathematician, the physician, and the astronomer were all engaged in a singular pursuit, to uncover the laws established by the Creator. Through their work, the Islamic world did not just bridge the gap between antiquity and the Renaissance. It built a new foundation of empirical science that would eventually propel the entire human race into the modern era. 1025 CE, Bukhara. If the mathematicians and astronomers had mapped the mechanics of the physical world, a new and more profound struggle was unfolding within the realm of the metaphysical. The question was no longer just how the stars moved or how the body healed, but how the human mind could reconcile the absolute truths of divine revelation with the rigorous, logical demands of Aristotelian philosophy. This was the era of the Great Synthesis, a period where the intellect was pushed to its absolute limit to understand the nature of God, the soul, and the cosmos. At the forefront of this intellectual storm stood Ibn Sina, or Avicenna. Having already revolutionized medicine, Ibn Sina turned his formidable intellect toward falsafa philosophy. To him, reason was not a threat to faith. It was a divine gift intended to illuminate it. He sought to create a seamless tapestry where Neoplatonic thought and Islamic monotheism coexisted. Ibn Sina proposed a sophisticated cosmology, arguing that the existence of the universe was a necessary consequence of a necessary existent, a being whose essence is existence itself. For Ibn Sina, the philosopher and the prophet were looking at the same truth from different vantage points, the philosopher through the lens of logic, and the prophet through the lens of revelation. He believed that the highest form of human intellect could actually achieve a state of mystical intuition, bridging the gap between rational thought and divine presence. However, this soaring rationalism sparked a profound reaction from those who feared that over-reliance on Greek logic might erode the sanctity of the unseen. This tension found its most influential voice in Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. 1100 CE, Tus. Al-Ghazali was a man of immense prestige, a master of law and theology who found himself gripped by a paralyzing spiritual crisis. He began to question the very foundations of his certainty. His journey led him to a radical critique of the philosophers, most famously articulated in his work, the incoherence of the philosopher's asterisk. Al-Ghazali did not seek to destroy reason. Rather, he sought to define its boundaries. He argued that while logic was a vital tool for mathematics and law, it was fundamentally incapable of grasping the ultimate truths of the divine essence or the nuances of the afterlife. To Al-Ghazali, the philosophers had made a category error. They attempted to use the finite tools of human logic to measure the infinite nature of God. He cautioned that a purely rationalist approach risked turning God into a mere concept, a mathematical necessity stripped of his will, his mercy, and his presence. In his pursuit of certainty, Al-Ghazali turned away from the lecture halls and toward the path of Sufism. He concluded that the highest knowledge was not found in the syllogisms of the Greeks, but in the tasting, the direct, experiential encounter with the divine through the heart. The encounter between Ibn Sina's rationalism and Al-Ghazali's spiritualism created a productive tension that would define Islamic thought for centuries. It was a dialogue between the head and the heart, between the logic of the mind and the intuition of the soul. This synthesis ensured that Islam would not become a religion of blind dogma, nor a philosophy of cold abstraction, but a living tradition where the pursuit of knowledge was viewed as an act of worship. 1200 CE, Baghdad. While the great thinkers were debating the boundaries of the soul and the mechanics of the divine, a different kind of movement was reshaping the world, one measured not in syllogisms, but in silver, silk, and spices. If the philosophers were the architects of the Islamic mind, the merchants were the architects of its reach. As the intellectual debates of Al-Ghazali and Ibn Sina settled into the bedrock of Islamic tradition, the empire's economic arteries began to pulse with unprecedented intensity. This was not merely the expansion of a state, but the creation of a globalized network that linked the Atlantic to the Pacific. Islam was no longer just a faith contained within the borders of caliphates. It was becoming the common language of international commerce. To the east, the legendary Silk Road served as the terrestrial lifeline of this era. Caravans, stretching as far as the eye could see, wound through the treacherous mountain passes of Central Asia and the vast deserts of Persia. These were not just convoys of luxury goods like Chinese silk or Samarkand paper. They were mobile libraries and lecture halls. As merchants traveled from city to city, they carried with them more than their wares. They carried the Sharia asterisk, providing a standardized legal framework that allowed a merchant in Bukhara to trade with a partner in Damascus with a shared understanding of contracts, ethics, and trust. The mosque and the caravanserai became the twin pillars of the roadside economy, one providing spiritual sanctuary, the other providing the infrastructure for global exchange. Simultaneously, a maritime revolution was unfolding across the turquoise waters of the Indian Ocean. While the Silk Road conquered the land, the monsoon winds conquered the sea. Muslim sailors, utilizing advanced celestial navigation and the lateen sail, transformed the Indian Ocean into a Muslim lake. From the bustling ports of the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea to the spice-rich coasts of Malabar and the archipelagos of Southeast Asia, the sea lanes were teeming with dhows. Unlike the later, often violent maritime expansions of European powers, the spread of Islam via these sea routes was characterized by a unique, organic phenomenon: the merchant missionary. In the ports of Indonesia, Malaysia, and East Africa, Islam did not arrive at the tip of a sword, but through the integrity of the marketplace. A local ruler might convert to Islam to secure better trade terms. A coastal community might adopt the faith to join a prestigious global network of prosperity. The faith was woven into the very fabric of daily survival and social mobility. This dual expansion, the overland caravans and the oceanic fleets, created a symbiotic world. The wealth generated by these networks funded the very house of wisdom and the great libraries we have discussed. The gold from West Africa, the spices from the Moluccas, and the porcelain from China all flowed into the great urban centers of the Islamic world, fueling a golden age that was as much about material abundance as it was about spiritual depth. Through trade, Islam became a universal civilization. It transcended ethnicity and geography, creating a cohesive, interconnected world where a traveler could journey from the shores of Morocco to the islands of Java, finding, in every port and every oasis, a familiar call to prayer and a shared code of conduct. The world was shrinking, not through conquest, but through the relentless, rhythmic pulse of the market. 909 CE, North Africa. But as the merchant caravans strengthened the connective tissue of the Islamic world, a profound political paradox was emerging. While the faith was becoming more unified through trade and law, the centralized authority of the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad was beginning to fray. The vast, interconnected network that had brought such immense wealth also brought the seeds of decentralization. The empire was becoming too large, too diverse, and too rich for a single center to command. The pulse of the market was driving the world forward, but the political structure of the caliphate was struggling to keep pace. From this tension, the era of the independent dynasties was born. No longer was power a singular stream flowing from Baghdad. It had become a series of powerful, competing rivers, each carving its own path through the landscape of history. Nowhere was this shift more radical than in the West, with the rise of the Fatimid Caliphate. Emerging from the Berber tribes of North Africa, the Fatimids did not merely seek autonomy. They sought to challenge the very legitimacy of the Abbasids. Claiming direct descent from Fatima, the daughter of the Prophet, they established a rival caliphate that would eventually seize Egypt and found the magnificent city of Cairo. The Fatimids were more than just a political breakaway. They were a theological revolution. Under their rule, the Islamic world saw the establishment of Al-Azhar, which would become one of the most significant centers of learning in human history. The competition between the Abbasid and Fatimid centers of power created a unique dynamism, a rivalry of intellect, architecture, and prestige that pushed the boundaries of what an Islamic state could achieve. While the Fatimids challenged the caliphate from the Mediterranean, a different kind of power was rising in the east, amidst the high plateaus and fertile valleys of Central Asia. This was the era of the Samanid dynasty. Unlike the Fatimids, the Samanids did not seek to replace the Abbasid caliph. Instead, they operated as sophisticated guardians of the faith, ruling as autonomous sultans under the nominal shadow of Baghdad. The Samanid era represents perhaps the most brilliant chapter of the fragmented Islamic world. Centered in Bukhara and Samarkand, the Samanids turned the periphery of the empire into its intellectual heart. It was under their patronage that the Persian language was revived and refined, blending with Islamic thought to create a cultural renaissance. The Samanid courts became the breeding grounds for the era's greatest minds, poets, scientists, and theologians who thrived in a landscape where local rulers competed to host the most learned scholars. This fragmentation, then, was not merely a story of decline or chaos. It was a redistribution of greatness. As the central grip of Baghdad loosened, the Islamic world entered a period of multipolar excellence. The political unity of the early conquests had been replaced by a sophisticated tapestry of regional powers. Each dynasty, whether the Shia Fatimids in the west or the Sunni Samanids in the east, contributed its own unique flavor to the civilization. The fragmentation of power did not break the Ummah. Rather, it decentralized its brilliance, ensuring that the Golden Age was not a single flame burning in Baghdad, but a constellation of lights illuminating the entire known world. 1095 CE, Clermont, France. While the Islamic world was a constellation of competing lights, a shadow was gathering in the west that would threaten to pull these lights into a storm of unprecedented violence. In the courts of Europe, a different kind of fervor was brewing, a movement born of religious zeal, political ambition, and the desire to reclaim the sites of the Holy Land. When Pope Urban II issued his call for a crusade, he wasn't just calling for a military campaign. He was calling for a holy war to wrest control of Jerusalem and the Levant from the hands of the Muslims. What followed was a seismic collision between two civilizations. As the first waves of the Crusader armies descended upon the Levant, they encountered a Muslim world that, while intellectually brilliant, was politically fractured. The very decentralization that had fueled the Golden Age now became a vulnerability. The Levant was a mosaic of competing interests. The Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt, the Seljuk Turks in Syria, and various local emirs, all of whom were often more concerned with their internal rivalries than with the common threat emerging from the sea. The fall of Jerusalem in 1099 sent shockwaves through the Islamic world. The establishment of the Crusader states, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Tripoli, marked a period of profound instability. For the first time in centuries, Christian military outposts were entrenched deep within the heartlands of Islam. The loss of these sacred spaces was not merely a military defeat, it was a spiritual wound that demanded a response. For decades, the response was fragmented. Local resistance was sporadic, and the Crusader presence seemed, to many, an insurmountable obstacle. But the pressure of the Crusader occupation began to act as a catalyst for a new kind of unity. The struggle for the Holy Land forced a slow, painful reorganization of Muslim political power. The era of independent, competing emirs began to give way to the era of the great unifiers. The Muslims realized that to repel the invaders, they could not rely on the shifting sands of tribal or local loyalties. They needed a centralized, military authority capable of sustained warfare. This realization set the stage for the rise of new, formidable powers that would eventually turn the tide. The struggle would no longer be fought by small, disconnected garrisons, but by massive, organized sultanates. The Crusades transformed the Levant into a permanent frontier of conflict, a landscape of fortresses and blood-soaked sieges. It was a period where the theological brilliance of the Golden Age had to be married to the grim realities of survival. As the Crusaders built their stone castles, the Muslim world began the arduous process of forging a new kind of leadership, one that would eventually rise to meet the challenge of the West. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would define the medieval era, a struggle that would test the resilience of the Ummah and eventually produce one of history's most legendary figures, an individual who would not just defend the faith, but would redefine the very nature of Islamic leadership in the face of an existential threat. 1164 CE, Damascus. The era of fragmentation was finally meeting its architect. Out of the complex political tapestry of the Levant and Egypt emerged a figure whose name would become synonymous with both chivalry and conquest. Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to the West as Saladin. Saladin's rise was not an overnight miracle, but a masterclass in patient, strategic unification. Initially serving under the Zengid dynasty, he was dispatched to Egypt to stabilize the crumbling Fatimid Caliphate. There, through a combination of astute diplomacy and decisive military action, he did more than just secure a province. He established the Ayyubid dynasty. By merging the military might of Syria with the vast resources and wealth of Egypt, Saladin achieved what generations of emirs had failed to do. He created a unified front. The Muslim world was no longer a collection of fractured city-states. It was becoming a cohesive superpower. With the foundation of a unified state laid, Saladin turned his eyes toward the ultimate objective, the reclamation of Jerusalem. The Crusader states, once triumphant, now found themselves encircled by a rising tide of organized resistance. The tension between the Ayyubid forces and the Kingdom of Jerusalem reached a breaking point in 1187. The decisive moment arrived on the scorching plains of Hattin. In a brilliant tactical maneuver, Saladin's cavalry outmaneuvered the Crusader armies, cutting them off from their water sources in the heat of the Galilee. The Battle of Hattin was not merely a military victory, it was the shattering of the Crusader military backbone. The Frankish knights, exhausted and thirsty, were decimated. With the field won, the road to the Holy City lay open. As Saladin's forces descended upon Jerusalem, the world held its breath. Many feared a repeat of the 1099 massacre, where the initial conquest of the city had been marked by unprecedented bloodshed. But the man leading the siege was not driven by vengeance, but by a profound sense of Islamic justice and statesmanlike restraint. When the city finally surrendered in October 1187, Saladin's actions redefined the ethics of medieval warfare. Rather than engaging in a campaign of slaughter, he allowed the Christian inhabitants to ransom themselves. He provided protection to the vulnerable and ensured that the holy sites of all three Abrahamic faiths were respected. This act of mercy did not diminish his conquest. Instead, it elevated his reputation, earning him the begrudging respect of his enemies and cementing his legacy as a ruler of unparalleled character. The reconquest of Jerusalem was a turning point that shifted the momentum of the Crusades permanently. While the West would attempt to respond with the Third Crusade, led by figures like Richard the Lionheart, the fundamental reality had changed. The Crusader presence in the Levant was no longer a dominant force, but a besieged one. Through the Ayyubid dynasty, the Muslim world had proven that through unity, discipline, and a fusion of faith and political pragmatism, it could not only survive external aggression but emerge from it more formidable than ever before. The shadow of the Crusades remained, but the light of the Ummah had found its shield. 1258 CE, Baghdad. For centuries, the lights of the Abbasid Caliphate had served as a beacon for the civilized world. Baghdad was not merely a capital, it was the beating heart of the Islamic Golden Age. Its streets were paved with the wealth of trade, its libraries held the sum of human knowledge, and its caliph sat upon a throne that represented the spiritual and political continuity of the Ummah. But as the Ayyubid shield held the Crusaders at bay in the west, a far more terrifying shadow was sweeping across the east. From the steppes of Central Asia, a storm was gathering, a storm of horsemen, iron, and unyielding fury. The Mongols, led by the grandson of Genghis Khan, Hulagu Khan, were unlike any adversary the Islamic world had ever faced. They were not seeking territory for settlement or tribute for trade. They were an unstoppable force of nature that moved with a singular, devastating purpose. As Hulagu's vast tumens descended upon Mesopotamia, the fractured political landscape of the Middle East offered little resistance. The Abbasid Caliph, al-Mustasim, found himself trapped in a nightmare of indecision. He underestimated the Mongol threat, believing that the prestige of the caliphate alone would act as a deterrent. He was tragically wrong. By January 1258, the Mongol encirclement of Baghdad was complete. The city, once the jewel of the world, was now a cage. The siege was relentless. Mongol engineers deployed advanced siege engines, hurling massive stones against the city's formidable walls, while their numbers swelled to a degree that seemed supernatural to the terrified inhabitants. Inside the walls, the atmosphere was one of apocalyptic dread. The scholars, the poets, and the common citizens watched as the horizon turned dark with the dust of approaching armies. When the walls finally breached, the catastrophe that followed was one of the darkest chapters in human history. The sack of Baghdad was not a battle, it was a systematic erasure. For days, the city was subjected to unprecedented violence. The House of Wisdom, the great repository of Greek, Persian, and Indian thought that had fueled the Golden Age, was targeted. Legend tells us that the Tigris River ran black with the ink of countless manuscripts thrown into its waters, and red with the blood of the city's scholars and citizens. The intellectual foundation of the Islamic world was being washed away in a single, bloody week. The end of the Abbasids was both symbolic and absolute. The Caliph, the last vestige of a lineage that had guided the Ummah since the days of Harun al-Rashid, was captured and executed. With his death, the political unity of the Islamic world was shattered. The era of the great caliphates had reached a violent, catastrophic conclusion. The fall of Baghdad sent shockwaves through the Muslim world. The center had collapsed. The scientific progress, the philosophical synthesis, and the economic prosperity that had defined the previous 5 centuries were momentarily extinguished. The Islamic world was left adrift, broken into regional powers, facing a period of profound trauma and existential crisis. Yet, even as the smoke cleared over the ruins of Baghdad, the spirit of the Ummah refused to die. The destruction of the center would necessitate a new kind of resilience, a survival that would eventually lead to the rise of new, even more powerful empires. 1260 CE, Ain Jalut. As the smoke of Baghdad's destruction still hung heavy over the ruins of Mesopotamia, the Mongol tide seemed destined to swallow everything in its path. The unstoppable storm had turned its gaze toward the Levant and Egypt, moving with the same predatory momentum that had erased the Abbasid legacy. To the Mongols, the Mamluk Sultanate, a burgeoning power of warrior slaves based in Cairo, was merely the next obstacle in an endless conquest. But the Mamluks were unlike any other force the Mongols had encountered. They were a unique military caste, former Turkic and Circassian slaves, trained from childhood in the rigorous arts of cavalry warfare, archery, and Islamic discipline. They were men who had been forged in the crucible of servitude to become the ultimate instruments of war. They did not fight for dynastic prestige or ancient lineage. They fought with the desperate, honed precision of professional soldiers who knew that their very existence depended on their ability to strike harder than the storm itself. The collision between these two titans took place in the valley of Ain Jalut. It was a moment of existential reckoning. If the Mamluks fell, the heart of the Islamic world, Egypt and the holy cities of the Hijaz, would fall with them. The battle was ferocious, a chaotic clash of iron and horseflesh. Under the leadership of Sultan Qutuz and the brilliant General Baybars, the Mamluks utilized the terrain and their superior discipline to trap the Mongol vanguard. For the first time in history, the myth of Mongol invincibility was shattered. The retreat of the Mongol forces signaled more than just a military victory. It was a psychological rebirth for the Muslim world. In the wake of this triumph, the Mamluks emerged as the undisputed guardians of Islam. While the political unity of the caliphate had been broken, the Mamluks stepped into the vacuum to provide a new kind of stability. They established a sultanate that would rule Egypt and Syria for over 2.5 centuries, transforming Cairo into the new intellectual and spiritual capital of the Islamic world. As the Mongols retreated to the east, the Mamluks turned their attention to the lingering threat in the west, the Crusader states. Through a series of relentless campaigns, they systematically dismantled the remnants of the Latin kingdoms in the Levant, reclaiming Jerusalem and securing the Mediterranean coast. They were no longer just soldiers. They were the architects of a new defensive order. Yet their legacy was not built solely on the sword. To solidify their legitimacy, the Mamluk sultans became prolific patrons of faith and learning. They constructed magnificent mosques, madrasas, and hospitals, decorating the skyline of Cairo with intricate stone carvings and soaring minarets. They provided a sanctuary for scholars fleeing the Mongol chaos, ensuring that the flame of Islamic science, law, and theology continued to burn brightly, even if the center in Baghdad had gone dark. The Mamluk era was a period of paradox, a regime born of slavery that rose to become the most formidable defenders of the faith. They were the shield that stood between the remnants of Islamic civilization and total annihilation, proving that even in an age of catastrophic collapse, resilience could forge a new and enduring greatness. 1453 CE, Constantinople. As the echoes of the Mamluk victories in the Levant settled into a period of defensive stability, a new and more explosive era was dawning across the Islamic world. The age of the horse and the bow was beginning to yield to a far more terrifying force: gunpowder. This transition would not merely change how wars were fought, it would redraw the map of the world, giving rise to three distinct, monumental powers: the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals. In the West, the Ottoman Turks were transforming from a frontier principality into a global superpower. For centuries, they had been a growing shadow on the edge of the Byzantine Empire, but the turning point arrived with the fall of Constantinople. Under the visionary leadership of Mehmed the Conqueror, the Ottomans utilized massive cannons, monsters of bronze and iron, to shatter the seemingly impregnable walls of the Roman capital. This was the dawn of the Gunpowder Age. With the conquest of the Queen of Cities, the Ottomans claimed the mantle of a true empire, bridging the gap between East and West. They were no longer just a nomadic warrior band. They were a centralized, sophisticated state that would soon extend its reach into the heart of Europe, the Mediterranean, and the holy cities, establishing a hegemony that would last for 600 years. While the Ottomans were consolidating their grip on the Mediterranean, a different kind of fire was being lit in the highlands of Persia. In the early 16th century, the Safavid dynasty emerged from the mystical traditions of Sufism to forge a new identity for the Persian people. Led by the charismatic Shah Ismail, the Safavids did more than just conquer territory. They fundamentally reshaped the spiritual landscape by establishing Twelver Shi'ism as the official state religion. This was a move of profound political and theological consequence, creating a distinct Persian Shiite identity that stood in direct, often violent, opposition to the Sunni Ottoman Caliphate. The Safavid era would become a renaissance of Persian art, architecture, and philosophy, turning cities like Isfahan into shimmering jewels of the Islamic world, fueled by a unique blend of imperial grandeur and deep spiritual devotion. Simultaneously, far to the east, the seeds of a third empire were being sown in the fertile plains of South Asia. The Mughals, descendants of both Timur and Genghis Khan, began their journey under Babur, a man whose ambition was as vast as the lands he sought to claim. Driven from Central Asia, Babur turned his gaze toward the wealthy, fractured kingdoms of India. At the Battle of Panipat, his disciplined use of artillery and musketry proved decisive, marking the birth of the Mughal Empire. This was not just a military conquest, but a cultural fusion. The Mughals would go on to weave together Persian, Turkic, and indigenous Indian traditions, creating a civilization of unparalleled opulence. These were the Gunpowder Empires, a triad of powers that used the technology of the New Age to stabilize, expand, and redefine Islamic civilization. Though they often clashed in a complex web of sectarian rivalry and territorial dispute, together they formed a vast, interconnected arc of Islamic influence that stretched from the gates of Vienna to the banks of the Ganges. The era of fragmented principalities was over. The era of the great imperial titans had begun. 1258 CE, Baghdad. While the rise of the Gunpowder Empires signaled a new era of centralized imperial grandeur, the memory of the previous century remained a bleeding wound in the collective psyche of the Muslim world. The catastrophic fall of Baghdad to the Mongols had done more than just end the Abbasid Caliphate. It had shattered the sense of cosmic order. For many, the world no longer felt like a place governed by divine stability, but rather a landscape of sudden, violent chaos where cities were leveled and libraries burned. It was within this vacuum of political security and the subsequent turbulence of shifting dynasties that Sufism, the mystical dimension of Islam, underwent a profound transformation. If the empires were defined by the outward expansion of borders and the roar of cannons, Sufism became the inward retreat toward the soul. It was a spiritual response to a world that had become increasingly unpredictable, material, and at times, terrifyingly violent. To the Sufi, the instability of the earthly realm, the rise and fall of sultans, the shifting of frontiers, and the brutality of conquest was merely a fleeting shadow. They taught that true stability could not be found in the halls of a palace or the strength of a garrison, but in the kalb asterisk, or the heart, through a direct, unmediated connection with the divine. As the political structures of the Islamic world reorganized into the massive Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal machines, Sufism provided the emotional and spiritual glue that held the community together. Sufi orders or tariqas became more than just paths of prayer. They became vital social institutions. In times of war and economic upheaval, the Khanqah's asterisk, the Sufi lodges offered sanctuary, food, and a sense of belonging to the displaced and the weary. The Sufi sheikh or master replaced the fallen caliph as a source of moral authority for many. While the sultans commanded the bodies of their subjects, the Sufi saints were seen as the guardians of their spirits. This mysticism also acted as a bridge in an era of growing sectarianism. As the Sunni Shiite divide deepened between the Ottomans and the Safavids, The universal language of divine love spoken by Sufi poets and saints offered a common ground. Figures like Rumi, whose influence continued to swell during these centuries, provided a vocabulary of longing and transcendence that bypassed the rigid legalism of state-sponsored theology. Their poetry spoke of a God who was not merely a distant judge, but a beloved to be sought through intoxication, music, and the remembrance of God, known as *d**. Furthermore, as Islam spread into new territories through trade and migration, it was often the Sufi dervishes, rather than the conquering armies, who acted as the vanguard of faith. Their emphasis on simplicity, humility, and the inner meaning of the Quran allowed Islam to weave itself into the local fabrics of South Asia, Africa, and Southeast Asia with a gentleness that avoided the friction of imperial imposition. Thus, Sufism became the silent heartbeat of the Islamic world. It was the internal sanctuary built in response to external storm. As the gunpowder empires marched across the earth, reshaping the world through steel and fire, the mystics moved through the world with stillness, reminding the faithful that while empires are destined to crumble, the journey toward the divine is eternal. 1453 CE, Constantinople. While the Sufi mystics were tending to the internal landscapes of the soul, a new, thunderous reality was reshaping the external map of the world. The era of the gunpowder empires had arrived, and at its vanguard stood the House of Osman. The fall of Constantinople to Sultan Mehmed II did more than just end the Byzantine Empire. It signaled the emergence of the Ottoman Turks as the preeminent superpower of the Mediterranean and the doorstep of Europe. As the smoke cleared over the Golden Horn, the Ottomans began a relentless ascent. Unlike the fragmented dynasties that had struggled in the wake of the Mongol invasions, the Ottomans were a machine of precision, fueled by a centralized administration and the devastating power of early modern artillery. Their expansion was not merely a series of raids, but a systematic movement of empire. By the late 15th and early 16th centuries, the Ottoman shadow stretched across the Balkans, deep into the heart of Hungary, and toward the gates of Vienna. For the Christian kingdoms of Europe, the Ottoman presence was an existential reality, a constant, looming pressure that forced the continent to redefine its own borders and identities. However, the Ottoman project was more than just territorial conquest. It was a quest for supreme religious legitimacy. For centuries, the concept of the caliphate, the leadership of the entire Muslim community, had been in a state of political limbo following the collapse of the Abbasids. The Ottomans sought to fill this void. The turning point came in 1517, when Sultan Selim I defeated the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt. With this victory, the Ottomans gained control over the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, as well as the sacred lands of the Levant. The prestige of the conqueror of Constantinople was now married to the sacred responsibility of the protector of the two holy mosques. Through this conquest, the Ottoman sultans claimed the title of caliph, formally uniting political sovereignty with spiritual leadership. They were no longer just nomadic warriors or regional lords. They were the undisputed leaders of the Sunni Muslim world, the heirs to a legacy of divine mandate. This hegemony created a unique, multi-continental Islamic state. The Ottoman Empire became a grand synthesis of diverse cultures, legal traditions, and ethnicities. Under the asterisk millet system, the empire managed its vast, religiously diverse populations with a sophisticated, if hierarchical, degree of autonomy, allowing Christians and Jews to govern their own communal affairs under the umbrella of Ottoman rule. At its zenith, the Ottoman Empire functioned as the bridge between the East and the West, the North and the South. From the magnificent mosques of Istanbul, adorned with the sweeping domes of Sinan, to the administrative corridors of the Topkapi Palace, the empire projected an image of absolute stability and grandeur. It was an era where the sword of the Sultan and the authority of the Caliph worked in tandem to create a period of unprecedented Islamic dominance. Yet, even as the empire reached its territorial and political peak, the very scale of its hegemony began to invite the pressures of a changing world. A world where the centers of global power were beginning to shift toward the Atlantic, and where the long shadow of the Ottoman eagle would eventually face the rising tides of modernity. 1501 CE Tabriz. While the Ottoman Sultan sat in Istanbul as the undisputed protector of the Sunni world, a different, more transformative fire was being stoked in the highlands of Persia. For centuries, the Iranian plateau had been a mosaic of diverse Islamic traditions, largely following the Sunni school of jurisprudence. But as the 16th century dawned, the political and spiritual landscape of the Middle East was about to undergo a tectonic shift that would create a permanent fracture in the Islamic world. The catalyst for this change was the rise of the Safavid dynasty. What began as a Sufi order, dedicated to the spiritual teachings of the Safaviya, had evolved into a formidable militant movement. Led by the charismatic and formidable Shah Ismail I, the Safavids were not merely seeking a kingdom, they were seeking a religious revolution. When Ismail marched into Tabriz and declared himself Shah, he did more than conquer territory. He issued a decree that would redefine the identity of Persia forever. He proclaimed Twelver Shi'ism as the official state religion. This was not a gradual transition, but a radical, top-down imposition. Through a combination of spiritual fervor and the sheer force of the Kizilbash, the elite Turkic warriors who viewed the Shah as a semi-divine figure, the Safavids began the systematic conversion of the Persian population. This move was as much a masterstroke of geopolitics as it was an act of faith. By formalizing Shia Islam, the Safavids created a distinct religious identity that served as a powerful bulwark against the expanding Sunni Ottoman Empire to the west. Persia was no longer just a territory. It was a sacred ideological fortress. The Safavid era ushered in what historians call the Persian Renaissance, a period of unparalleled cultural and intellectual flowering. As the state stabilized, the Safavids moved their capital to Isfahan, a city that would become one of the most beautiful urban centers in the world. Under the reign of Shah Abbas the Great, Isfahan was transformed into half the world. It was a city of breathtaking symmetry, where the Nakshi Jahan Square stood as a testament to the empire's wealth and sophistication. Here, the turquoise domes of magnificent mosques, like the Shah Mosque, rose toward the sky, blending intricate geometry with profound theological symbolism. This was a period where the Persian language, having already been refined by centuries of poetry, became the primary vehicle for high culture, science, and diplomacy across much of the Islamic East. The Safavid court became a magnet for philosophers, architects, and artists, fostering a unique synthesis of Shia theology and Persian aesthetic traditions. This Persianate culture would eventually influence the Mughal courts in India and the Ottoman administration, creating a shared intellectual vocabulary that transcended borders. However, this renaissance was forged in the crucible of perpetual conflict. The rivalry between the Sunni Ottomans and the Shia Safavids turned the Middle East into a permanent battlefield, a geopolitical struggle that established the borders and sectarian identities that continue to resonate in the modern era. The Safavids had succeeded in their mission. They had transformed Persia from a peripheral province of the broader Islamic world into a centralized, ideologically cohesive, and culturally radiant empire, a Shia heartland that would stand as a permanent counterweight to the Ottoman hegemony. 1526 CE, Panipat. As the Safavid flame burned brightly in the west, a new, equally radiant sun was rising in the east. While the Persian plateau was consolidating its Shia identity, the vast, fertile plains of the Indian subcontinent were about to witness a different kind of Islamic metamorphosis. This was not a conquest of conversion through decree, but a conquest of synthesis, the birth of the Mughal Empire. The architect of this new era was Babur, a descendant of both Timur and Genghis Khan. Driven from the rugged mountains of Fergana, he turned his gaze toward the riches of Hindustan. At the First Battle of Panipat, Babur's mastery of gunpowder and artillery shattered the Lodi Sultanate, marking the arrival of a dynasty that would weave Islamic governance into the incredibly complex tapestry of Indian civilization. Unlike the rigid ideological boundaries being drawn between the Ottomans and the Safavids, the Mughals faced a unique challenge. They were a Muslim minority ruling over a vast Hindu majority. This reality forced a profound evolution in how Islam was practiced and projected. The Mughal emperors did not merely seek to rule India, they sought to become part of its soul. This spirit of integration reached its zenith under Akbar the Great. Akbar realized that to sustain an empire of such immense diversity, the sword alone would not suffice. He cultivated a court of unprecedented pluralism, inviting scholars of Islam, Hinduism, Jainism, and Christianity to engage in spirited debate. His policy of *Sulaykal*, or universal peace, sought to create a stable social fabric where the Islamic faith could flourish alongside the diverse traditions of the subcontinent. Under the Mughals, Islam in India became characterized by a beautiful, often mystical, blending of Persian elegance and Indian vibrancy. This cultural synthesis gave birth to the Indo-Persian style, a breathtaking fusion of geometry, calligraphy, and local craftsmanship. It was an era where the Sufi saints, with their message of divine love and inward devotion, acted as the spiritual bridge between the imperial court and the common people. The mosques and tombs of the Mughals were not just structures of stone, they were prayers in marble, reflecting a theology that found beauty in harmony and order. As the empire matured, this splendor reached its most iconic, heartbreakingly beautiful expression under Shah Jahan. It was during this period that the world saw the creation of the Taj Mahal. Built as a mausoleum for his beloved Mumtaz Mahal, this monument stands as the ultimate testament to the Mughal aesthetic. Its white marble, inlaid with precious stones in delicate floral patterns, represents a pinnacle of Islamic architectural symmetry, a terrestrial reflection of the gardens of paradise described in the Quran. The Mughal era transformed the Indian subcontinent into one of the wealthiest and most culturally sophisticated centers of the Islamic world. From the grand forts of Agra to the bustling markets of Delhi, the empire fostered a golden age of literature, miniature painting, and administrative precision. While the Safavids had built a Shia fortress in Persia, the Mughals had built a cosmopolitan garden in India. They proved that Islam could be more than a political force. It could be a cultural prism, refracting the light of diverse traditions into a single, dazzling spectacle of imperial majesty. 1550 CE, Istanbul. While the Mughal emperors were sculpting a cosmopolitan garden in the east, the center of gravity for the entire world was beginning to tilt. For centuries, the Islamic world had functioned as the indispensable middleman of global commerce. From the bustling markets of Cairo and the sophisticated caravanserais of Persia to the maritime ports of the Indian Ocean, the Islamic caliphates and sultanates sat at the crossroads of the world. They controlled the Silk Road and the spice routes, reaping the immense wealth generated by the flow of silk, spices, incense, and gold between China, India, and Europe. But in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, a tectonic shift occurred, not in theology but in geography. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 had consolidated Ottoman power, but it also sent a tremor through the European consciousness. Driven by a desperate need to bypass the Ottoman monopoly on Eastern luxuries, European powers, led by Portugal and later Spain and the Netherlands, turned their eyes toward the Atlantic. They were no longer looking at the Mediterranean, they were looking at the horizon. When Vasco da Gama successfully rounded the Cape of Good Hope and reached the shores of India in 1498, the era of the middleman began to crumble. This was the birth of the Atlantic shift. Suddenly, the maritime routes that had been the lifeblood of the Islamic economies were being circumvented. European carracks and galleons began to sail directly from Lisbon and Seville to the Malabar coast and the Indonesian archipelago. They were no longer paying duties to the Mamluks or the Ottomans. They were creating a direct, ocean-spanning bypass that siphoned wealth away from the traditional Islamic trade arteries. The impact was profound and multifaceted. Economically, the center of global wealth began to drift away from the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean toward the Atlantic coast of Europe. The massive revenues that once flowed into the coffers of the Islamic empires through transit taxes and trade duties began to dwindle. This was not a sudden collapse, but a slow, systemic erosion of economic dominance. Furthermore, the arrival of the Europeans brought a new, more aggressive form of commerce. The Portuguese, in particular, did not merely seek to trade. They sought to control. Through the establishment of fortified trading posts and a cartaz system, a naval license required for all merchant ships, they began to militarize the Indian Ocean, a sea that had historically been a space of relatively free and peaceful commerce. As the Atlantic powers grew fat on the riches of the New World and the direct spice trade, the great Islamic empires found themselves in a precarious position. The Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals remained colossal, culturally magnificent and militarily formidable, but the fundamental engine of global wealth was changing its course. The world was moving from a land-based, Silk Road-centric economy to a maritime, ocean-based global market. This shift set the stage for a new chapter in history. As the Islamic world continued to refine its internal splendor and intellectual traditions, it was simultaneously being forced to contend with a new global reality. A world where the oceans, once mere pathways for trade, had become the primary theaters of power, and where the distant Atlantic was beginning to dictate the fate of the ancient East. 1650 CE, Cairo. As the economic foundations of the Islamic world began to erode under the pressure of Atlantic maritime dominance, a secondary, more internal crisis began to take root. It was a crisis not of gold or spices, but of the mind. For centuries, the Islamic world had been synonymous with intellectual dynamism. The Golden Age had proven that faith and reason were not enemies, but two wings of the same bird. However, as the external world underwent a radical transformation through the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, the great Islamic centers of learning began to feel a growing sense of inertia. This period is often characterized by historians as a time of intellectual stagnation, but that term is a subject of intense debate. To many, it appeared that the gates of *80 had *, the independent legal and intellectual reasoning that had fueled the early centuries of Islamic thought, were being closed. In its place, a culture of *tackled *, or strict imitation of established legal precedents and traditional doctrines, began to dominate the scholarly landscape. The debate was profound. On one side stood the traditionalists. For them, the preservation of the sacred law and the established consensus of the scholars was the only way to protect the integrity of the faith from the perceived chaos of a changing world. In an era of political instability and economic decline, many felt that looking backward to the perceived purity of the past was a safer harbor than venturing into the uncertain waters of new, foreign ideas. They argued that the foundational truths of Islam were complete, and that any attempt to reinterpret them through the lens of Western science or philosophy was a dangerous concession to unbelief. On the other side were the voices of reform, though they were often quiet and fragmented. These thinkers recognized that the widening gap between Islamic scholarship and European technological advancement was not merely a matter of prestige, but of survival. They saw that while the West was mastering the laws of physics, the mechanics of gunpowder, and the mathematics of navigation, the Islamic world was increasingly focused on the minutiae of legal tradition. They argued that the Quran and the Sunnah were not static relics, but living guides that required constant re-engagement with the realities of the age. This was not merely a debate over science. It was a debate over the very nature of truth. Could a Muslim embrace the empirical methods of the West without losing their spiritual identity? Could the traditional structures of the madrasa evolve to include the study of the natural world, or would they remain focused solely on the divine sciences? As the 17th and 18th centuries progressed, this tension simmered beneath the surface of imperial grandeur. The magnificent mosques and sprawling palaces of the Ottomans and Mughals continued to rise, projecting an image of eternal stability. But beneath the surface, the intellectual engine that had once driven the world forward was slowing. The great divergence had begun. While Europe was beginning to harness the power of reason to reshape the physical world, the Islamic heartlands were increasingly turning inward, seeking refuge in the familiar, the proven, and the traditional. This inward turn would define the intellectual landscape of the Islamic world for generations, setting the stage for the explosive and often painful encounters with modernity that were to come. 1798 CE, Egypt. The silence of the intellectual inward turn was shattered not by a philosophical debate, but by the thunder of cannons and the sight of unfamiliar sails on the horizon. When Napoleon Bonaparte's French expeditionary force landed on the shores of Alexandria, it signaled more than just a military campaign. It signaled the arrival of a new, predatory era. For centuries, the Islamic world had viewed Europe as a collection of fragmented, peripheral states. But as the Enlightenment had transformed the West, it had also forged a machine of unprecedented industrial and military efficiency. The French occupation of Egypt acted as a violent catalyst. It forced the Ottoman-ruled territories to confront a terrifying reality. The gap between the Islamic empires and the European powers was no longer just intellectual, it was existential. The Great Divergence was no longer a theoretical concept discussed in quiet libraries. It was a physical force capable of dismantling centuries of imperial sovereignty. As the 19th century unfolded, this encounter shifted from sporadic military incursions to a systematic, creeping expansion known as European colonialism. The mechanisms of control were multifaceted. It began with gunboat diplomacy, where European powers used their superior naval technology to dictate terms to the Sublime Porte in Istanbul. It transitioned into economic subjugation, as the burgeoning industrial economies of Britain, France, and later Germany required vast new markets and raw materials. Through debt traps and unequal treaties, the once wealthy provinces of the Islamic world were being tethered to a global financial system designed by and for the West. In North Africa, the Maghreb, the impact was devastating. France's conquest of Algeria in 1830 initiated a period of settler colonialism that would fundamentally alter the region's social and demographic fabric. In the East, the British and French played a complex game of divide and rule, maneuvering through the declining Ottoman territories to secure strategic routes to India and the East. The Suez Canal, completed in 1869, became a symbol of this era, a marvel of Western engineering that simultaneously functioned as a geopolitical leash, ensuring that the arteries of global trade were controlled by European interests. Even within the Indian subcontinent, the Mughal splendor that had once defined the region was being methodically dismantled by the British East India Company. What began as a commercial enterprise evolved into a bureaucratic and military hegemony, fundamentally restructuring the social, legal, and educational systems of millions of Muslims. This was a period of profound trauma and profound paradox. On one hand, the colonial encounter brought with it the tools of modernity, the printing press, modern medicine, and new administrative structures. On the other hand, these tools were often deployed to undermine the very foundations of Islamic identity and political autonomy. The encounter was not a meeting of equals, but a collision between an era of imperial tradition and an era of industrial expansionism. As the shadows of European flags began to stretch across the map from Morocco to Indonesia, the Muslim world found itself in a desperate race. The struggle was no longer just about reclaiming the lost glory of the Golden Age. It was a struggle to define what it meant to be Muslim in a world where the traditional centers of power had been eclipsed by a new, relentless, and globalized West. 1916 CE, London and Damascus. If the 19th century was defined by the slow, creeping shadow of economic and military encroachment, the early 20th century brought a sudden, violent surgical strike that would permanently alter the geography of the Muslim world. As the Great War tore through Europe, the Ottoman Empire, the last great shield of the Caliphate, found itself caught in the gears of a global struggle that would result in its systematic dismantling. The true architects of this transformation were not found on the battlefields of the Levant, but in the secretive rooms of the British Foreign Office. Here, the Sykes-Picot Agreement was drafted, a map drawn in ink by diplomats who had never walked the streets of Baghdad, Cairo, or Damascus. With a ruler and a pencil, Britain and France carved up the Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire into mandates, treating centuries-old communities, religious landscapes, and tribal territories as mere spoils of war. The impact was nothing short of seismic. Lines were drawn through the heart of the Middle East, arbitrary borders that ignored the organic realities of ethnicity, sect, and history. In the Levant, the unified political landscape was fractured into artificial states: Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Transjordan. These borders did more than just create new nations. They trapped rival groups within single administrative units and split unified peoples across different jurisdictions. The result was a legacy of perpetual instability. As the nation-state model, an inherently European construct, was forced upon a region whose identity was rooted in the ***, the global community of believers. The political vacuum left by the retreating Ottomans would be filled by colonial administrators, creating a tension between local aspirations and foreign control that continues to define the region's conflicts to this day. Simultaneously in South Asia, the colonial impact reached a fever pitch. The British Raj, having already dismantled the Mughal political structure, was moving toward its final, most rigid phase of control. The partition of the Indian subcontinent was not merely a change in administration, but a profound psychological and social rupture. As the British prepared to depart, the logic of divide and rule had successfully calcified religious identities into political blocs. The eventual partition of 1947, which birthed Pakistan and India, was the culmination of this colonial legacy, a moment of immense hope for Muslim sovereignty, but one accompanied by a catastrophic exodus of millions and a cycle of communal violence that remains a volatile fault line in global politics. The colonial era had effectively reconfigured the Muslim world from a continuous belt of interconnected empires into a fragmented mosaic of nation-states and protectorates. The traditional centers of gravity, the Caliphate in Istanbul, the Sultanate in Delhi, the dynasties of the Maghreb, were replaced by a new, fractured reality. By the mid-20th century, the map of Islam had been fundamentally rewritten. The struggle for independence was no longer just about expelling foreign troops. It was about navigating the very borders those troops had drawn. The Muslim identity was now forced to exist within the confines of a Westphalian system of sovereignty, a system that often stood in direct opposition to the historical, spiritual, and political unity that had characterized the Islamic world for over a millennium. 1924 CE, Istanbul. The silence that fell over the halls of the Sublime Porte was not merely the silence of a defunct government, but the silence of an era ending. For centuries, the Ottoman Sultan had held a dual mantle. He was the sovereign of a vast, multi-ethnic empire and, more crucially, the Caliph, the symbolic and spiritual successor to the Prophet, the guardian of the Islamic world. But as the dust of the First World War settled, the institutional pillars of this ancient office crumbled. In a swift, controversial move, the Grand National Assembly of Turkey, led by the nationalist forces of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, formally abolished the caliphate. This was more than a political reorganization. It was a profound ontological shock to the Muslim world. For over 1,000 years, the concept of the caliphate had provided a sense of political and spiritual continuity, a singular point of gravity to which the asterisk Ummah could look. With its dissolution, the theoretical framework of a unified Islamic political identity was severed from the reality of the New World Order. The shield of Islam had been lowered, leaving a vacuum that would be contested for decades to come. As the spiritual center in Istanbul vanished, the political landscape was rapidly hardening into the rigid structures of the modern nation-state. The transition was jarring. The old world was defined by fluid borders, shifting loyalties, and a religious identity that transcended geography. The new world, however, demanded loyalty to the flag, the anthem, and the passport. The arbitrary lines drawn by Sykes and Picot were no longer just colonial impositions. They were becoming the permanent realities of sovereign states. In the decades that followed, the Muslim world faced a crisis of dual identity. On one hand, there was the pull of the nation, the desire for self-determination, modern governance, and economic development within the framework of the international community. On the other, there was the enduring, unshakable pull of the ****, the spiritual and cultural yearning for a unity that the map of the Middle East and South Asia seemed designed to prevent. This tension birthed a spectrum of responses. Some leaders sought to embrace the nation-state, attempting to fuse Islamic values with modern nationalism to build stable, secular, or semi-religious republics. Others looked backward, mourning the loss of the caliphate and seeking to revive its essence through pan-Islamic movements that rejected the legitimacy of colonial borders altogether. The fall of the Ottoman Empire did not just change the maps. It changed the very question of what it meant to be a Muslim in a modern, globalized world. It forced a transition from a world of imperial subjects to a world of national citizens. As the mid-20th century approached, the struggle was no longer just about reclaiming territory from colonial masters, but about defining the soul of a community that had been politically fragmented, yet remained spiritually unified. The era of the great empires was dead. The era of the nation-state had begun, and the struggle to reconcile the two would become the defining drama of modern Islamic history. 1920s CE, Cairo and Aligarh. As the dust of the collapsing empires settled, a profound intellectual struggle ignited across the Muslim world. The crisis was not merely political, it was existential. For centuries, Islamic law and social structures had operated within a traditional framework that many scholars felt was being rendered obsolete by the rapid, aggressive march of Western modernity. The question was no longer just how to survive under colonial rule, but how to exist as a Muslim in a world defined by industrialization, parliamentary democracy, and scientific rationalism. From this friction emerged the modernist reform movements. These were not movements seeking to abandon faith, but rather to rediscover its core essence in a way that could withstand the pressures of the 20th century. The proponents of Islamic modernism argued that the perceived stagnation of the Muslim world was not caused by Islam itself, but by a centuries-old tradition of rigid interpretation and the closing of the gates of ***, independent legal reasoning. In British India, thinkers like Sir Syed Ahmed Khan spearheaded a revolution of the mind. He argued that there was no inherent conflict between the true teachings of the Quran and the laws of nature discovered through science. To Khan and his followers, the Muslim community could only regain its dignity by mastering modern education and embracing the tools of Western technology, while simultaneously purifying their faith from superstitious accretions. This was a call to intellectual rebirth, to prove that Islam was not a relic of the medieval past, but a dynamic force capable of steering a modern state. In the Arab world, The echoes of this movement were felt through the works of thinkers like Mohammed Abda. In the halls of Al-Azhar University, Abda sought to bridge the widening chasm between traditional theology and modern sociology. He championed the idea that Islam was fundamentally a rational religion. By revisiting the primary sources, the Quran and the Sunnah, and applying reason to contemporary problems, reformers believed they could create a middle path. This path rejected both the blind imitation of Western secularism and the stagnant traditionalism of the old clerical elite. These reformers were attempting a delicate balancing act, a reconciliation. They sought to modernize the outer asterisk structures of society, its schools, its legal codes, its political institutions, while preserving the asterisk inner asterisk sanctity of the faith. They envisioned a world where a Muslim could be a scientist, a doctor, or a statesman without sacrificing their spiritual identity. However, this movement was met with fierce resistance. To the traditionalists, modernism looked like a surrender to Western cultural hegemony, a slow erosion of the sacred by the secular. To the burgeoning political radicals, it was often seen as too cautious, too willing to work within the very systems that had colonized them. This intellectual tug-of-war created a deep fracture within the Muslim consciousness. It set the stage for a century of debate that continues to this day. Is modernity an external force to be resisted, or an internal tool to be mastered? As the mid-20th century unfolded, the ideas born in these reformist circles would go on to shape the very fabric of new nation-states, influencing everything from constitutional law to the way a person prays in a modern city. The struggle to reconcile the eternal with the ephemeral had become the heartbeat of the modern Muslim experience. 1940s CE, Jakarta, Cairo, and Delhi. The intellectual debates of the reformists were about to face their ultimate crucible, the transition from theory to reality. As the tides of global decolonization surged, the abstract questions of faith versus reason were replaced by the visceral, urgent demands of nation-building. The era of colonial administration was ending, but the era of the nation-state was only just beginning. For much of the Muslim world, independence did not arrive as a unified triumph, but as a complex and often fractured liberation. The departure of British, French, and Dutch administrators left behind a vacuum of power and a profound crisis of identity. These new nations were born into a world of borders drawn by colonial powers, lines on a map that often ignored the organic realities of tribal, ethnic, and religious landscapes. The challenge was no longer just how to be a modern Muslim, but how to be a citizen of a specific state while remaining part of a global asterisk. In South Asia, the birth of Pakistan in 1947 represented perhaps the most radical attempt to solve this equation. It was the realization of the two-nation theory, a political manifestation of the idea that Muslims required their own sovereign territory to protect their religious and cultural identity. Yet the triumph was shadowed by the trauma of partition, displacement, and the daunting task of constructing a state that could balance Islamic values with the requirements of a modern democratic republic. Across the Middle East, the collapse of the Ottoman Caliphate left a spiritual and political void that many sought to fill through various forms of nationalism. In Egypt, the rise of Gamal Abdel Nasser and the ideology of Pan-Arabism sought to unify the Arab world through a shared linguistic and political destiny, often placing secular Arab identity at the forefront. In other regions, The struggle was between those who envisioned a state governed by strict Sharia law and those who advocated for a secular, Westphalian model of governance. This period saw the emergence of a profound tension. The struggle for sovereignty was as much about the soul as it was about the soil. Leaders and intellectuals found themselves caught between two competing visions of progress. On one hand, there was the drive for authentic modernity, the desire to build strong, centralized states with modern militaries and economies, while ensuring that the moral compass of the nation remained rooted in Islamic ethics. On the other hand, there was the fear of westernization, where the adoption of foreign political models was seen as a new, more subtle form of colonization, a colonization of the mind and the heart. As these new nations navigated their first decades of independence, they became laboratories for the modern Muslim experience. They grappled with the complexities of constitutionalism, the role of women in a changing society, and the tension between traditional jurisprudence and civil law. The struggle for sovereignty was never just about removing a foreign flag. It was about deciding which flag would fly over the conscience of the people. The post-colonial era proved that independence was not an end point, but a new beginning. It was the moment when the centuries-old heritage of Islam collided head-on with the rigid structures of the modern world, forcing a generation to define what it truly meant to be free, to be sovereign, and to be Muslim in a world that had been irrevocably changed. 2000 CE, London, Paris, and New York. As the 20th century drew to a close, the political boundaries of the post-colonial nation-state began to encounter a new, unstoppable force: the fluidity of human movement. The rigid lines drawn by colonial administrators were being blurred by the realities of a hyper-connected, globalized world. For the first time in history, the Islamic experience was being decoupled from specific geographic territories. The Ummah was no longer merely a community of believers residing within the borders of established Muslim-majority states. It was becoming a global, transnational presence. Mass migration, driven by economic opportunity, political instability, and the search for refuge, carried the traditions, languages, and rhythms of the Islamic world into the heart of the West. In the bustling suburbs of Europe and the sprawling metropolises of North America, new Muslim diasporas began to take root. This was not merely a demographic shift, but a profound cultural encounter. In these new contexts, Muslims found themselves navigating a dual identity. They were citizens of secular, liberal democracies, yet they remained deeply anchored to an ancient, sacred tradition. The diaspora experience forced a radical reevaluation of religious practice. How does one maintain the sanctity of the asterisk at hand in a city of skyscrapers? How do the rhythms of Ramadan integrate with a Western work week? In these spaces, a new, hybrid Islamic identity emerged, one that was often more cosmopolitan, diverse, and pluralistic than the traditions of the homelands. The diaspora became a laboratory for a modern, pluralistic expression of faith, where the questions of identity were no longer about defending a territory, but about asserting a presence in a multicultural landscape. Simultaneously, the turn of the millennium ushered in the most significant revolution in human communication: the digital age. If migration moved people, the internet moved ideas. The digital revolution shattered the traditional gatekeeping of religious authority. For centuries, Islamic knowledge had been passed down through a structured hierarchy of scholars, madrasas, and local imams. Today, that hierarchy is being challenged by the democratization of information. Through social media, streaming platforms, and mobile applications, the Islamic world has entered a digital frontier. A young believer in Jakarta can now engage in real-time theological debates with a scholar in Cairo, or follow a spiritual influencer in London. This has led to an unprecedented explosion of religious literacy and connectivity, but it has also birthed new complexities. The digital Ummah is a vast, decentralized network where traditional orthodoxy must constantly contend with the rapid-fire spread of diverse, and sometimes radical, interpretations. In this digital landscape, the struggle for the soul of Islam has moved from the pulpit to the smartphone. The Internet has provided tools for immense empowerment, allowing marginalized voices to be heard and enabling global charitable movements to mobilize in seconds. Yet, it has also created echo chambers that can deepen sectarian divides. As we move deeper into the 21st century, Islam finds itself in a state of profound, dynamic flux. It is an era defined by the paradox of being more connected than ever before, yet facing unprecedented challenges to its cohesion. From the streets of London to the digital clouds of the Internet, the story of Islam is no longer a history of empires and borders, but a story of a global community navigating the complexities of a world without limits. 2024 CE, a global digital landscape. As we stand in the third decade of this new millennium, the trajectory of the Ummah is being shaped by a collision of monumental forces. We are witnessing a period of history where the ancient and the cutting edge do not merely coexist. They collide, creating a friction that is both destabilizing and profoundly creative. The first great challenge is the struggle for intellectual and social cohesion in an age of fragmentation. For much of the 20th century, the primary concern of the Muslim world was the reclamation of political sovereignty. But in the 21st century, the battlefield has shifted to the realm of identity and ideology. The Ummah faces a profound internal tension. The struggle to reconcile traditional Islamic jurisprudence with the rapid-fire advancements of biotechnology, artificial intelligence, and shifting global ethics. How does a faith rooted in eternal truths navigate a world of shifting moral relativism? How do Muslim-majority societies bridge the widening chasm between traditionalist interpretations and the aspirations of a highly educated, tech-savvy youth population? Furthermore, the political landscape remains fraught. The ghost of the colonial era continues to haunt the Middle East and North Africa, manifesting in fragile states, protracted conflicts, and the persistent specter of extremism. These instabilities do not just affect the regions where they occur, they ripple outward, influencing global politics, fueling migration crises, and triggering the rise of Islamophobia in the West. The challenge for the modern Ummah is to find a way to transcend these cycles of violence and political volatility, moving toward a model of governance and cooperation that reflects both Islamic values and the requirements of a modern, interconnected state system. Yet, where there is friction, there is also immense opportunity. The very forces that threaten to divide the Ummah are also providing the tools for its unprecedented revitalization. The demographic reality is a powerful engine of potential. While much of the Northern Hemisphere faces aging populations and stagnation, the Muslim world is characterized by a massive, burgeoning youth bulge. This is a generation of digital natives, entrepreneurial, interconnected, and intellectually hungry. If harnessed through education and economic reform, this demographic dividend could propel the Islamic world into a new era of scientific, economic, and cultural leadership. The globalization that once threatened to dilute religious identity is now serving as a conduit for its expansion. We are seeing the rise of a global Islamic economy, where ethical finance, modest fashion, and halal technology are becoming multi-billion-dollar industries that bridge East and West. We see the emergence of a civilizational dialogue, where the diverse voices of the diaspora, from the scientists in Silicon Valley to the artists in Berlin, are redefining what it means to be Muslim in a pluralistic world. The future of the asterisk Ummah will not be written by the expansion of borders, but by the strength of its ideas and the depth of its compassion. The challenge of the 21st century is to move beyond the defensive posture of the past and toward a proactive, constructive engagement with the world. The goal is to build a community that is unapologetically rooted in its sacred heritage, yet vibrantly engaged with the future, a community that contributes to the global quest for justice, knowledge, and peace. The story of Islam is far from over. It is merely entering its most complex, challenging, and potentially transformative chapter yet.